You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with the barrister and futurist Andrew Eborn and the Guardian columnist Zoe Williams. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. Well, the Guardian reports on the US calling their airstrikes on Iran-linked militias just the start, following the deadly attack on 3 American troops a week ago. The Financial Times reports that the Iranian government used UK-based accounts with Lloyds and Santander to masquerade as British companies in order to move money around the world to evade sanctions. Both banks have said they don't comment on individual customers, but are committed to complying with international sanctions. The Eye reveals that Chancellor Jeremy Hunt may boost defence spending in next month's budget to bolster the UK's firepower in the Red Sea. The Express front page covers the tragic death of Esther Martin, who was attacked by 2 dogs in Essex yesterday. Police are still working with experts to establish the breed of the dogs. The Times is reporting that there's a huge public demand to provide the NHS to digitally store patients' health information in one place so that any doctor treating them can access their records no matter where they are. In the Sun, they report on an unnamed Premier League football star being the first to go to rehab for an addiction to laughing gas. And the Daily Star reports that Britain will face 3 seasons of weather this week, with a warm spring blast set to be followed by heavy rain and snow. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by Zoe Williams and Andrew Eborn. Welcome to you both. Let's start with the front page of the Eye and this report that Jeremy Hunt is expected to increase defence spending in the budget, allegedly.
You can tell the kind of insidery feel, but because the report is that a defence insider has said that Jeremy Hunt gets it. So it's quite kind of informal. It's quite, you know, this was just a chat. This wasn't a briefing. And the language is quite carefully picked, I think, so that it can't really be stuck on anybody, but it has a ring of truth. It does seem as though enough interventions have been made by enough military figures that Jeremy Hunt at least has to pay lip service to giving more money, because you can't endlessly, you know, join bomb strikes and talk about war without with a kind of chronically underfunded.
Absolutely, and it's horrendous. I mean, the defence of the nation has got to be paramount, and it couldn't have come.
I don't agree with that, but carry on.
Well, but within the rest of it as well. And the trouble is, it's not just our nation. We're providing weapons to other people as well. So the horrendous cost of these things needs to be looked at, and it couldn't have come at a worse time. I mean, Biden has said that he wants to make sure that things are finished quickly with Gaza, so he can get it before the elections, so on and so forth. And it couldn't have come at a worse time for Hunt, if you like, on that sort of basis.
Arguably, there's never a good time for a third world war.
No, you're right, but the cost element of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's really problematic because he has very limited headroom, as the cover of the Eye says, and it's going to be very hard for them to make the case on absolutely anything else. And they do need to make the case if they want to do what they, you know, to go into the election with any kind of manifesto that reflects who the Conservatives say they are. They're going to have to talk about belt tightening.
Yes. Now,
to talk about belt tightening while you're making massive spending on the army, I think will really cause problems for them on the doorstep, as they say.
Yeah, and the trouble is there's calls on all sorts of things about health and education and so on and so forth, but you need to make sure the defence is in there.
And I think buy-in for, you know, whatever people say, whatever language people use about whether the aircraft carriers are worth it if they're not working, what our responsibilities are as a NATO player, what our responsibilities are as a partner with America, whatever language people are using, certainly there will be a huge number of people who are saying, well, if we can't afford anything, I mean, you know, we're in the middle of this cost of living crisis. I'm not sure that defence systems are I'm not sure we can afford to be the nation we say we are on the world stage.
But Andrew, the Chancellor, because this is the discourse now, he is going to be under tremendous pressure to spend, isn't he, in this direction?
Absolutely. And as I say, there are calls on him from all sides, not just on defence, but on health and education and various other things as well. So I say it couldn't have come at a worse time in terms of this sort of stuff, and what he was hoping would be a bit of headroom to basically give some tax breaks and everything else. They've got to look at how you balance it. But with all these things, you need to look at the whole picture. And people sort of just say in isolation, we're going to spend it all on this, it's going to cost us billions, is the actual sort of figures. We need to turn around and say, well, what else are other things going to cost? What are we going to lose as a result of it? And I think if people understand that, the communication needs to be improved to say, look, this is what we need and why.
Meanwhile, the state of the forces and the equipment has been under discussion as well. And we look at the FT and read that one of the UK's 2 state-of-the-art aircraft carriers will not take part in the largest NATO exercise in Europe since the Cold War after last-minute checks identified a problem with its propeller.
The thing is with these aircraft carriers, I don't know if I've remembered this correctly, but when they were first ready for use, the whole story was we'd spent billions of pounds on them, and they weren't even fully equipped. They didn't even have the wherewithal to do the job they were intended to do.
Yes.
Now, that seems to have been resolved to the degree that they can be deployed, but not if their propellers aren't working.
No, but it's nonsense, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the figures are staggering. I checked just before we came on air, and apparently it was 7.6 billion for 2 of these things, and they've had problems. And what are they sort of? They've got to reliability, readiness gaps, and capability shortfalls, is what they say.
Yeah.
Well, what are you spending your money on?
I know. I love that phrase, readiness gaps.
Yes, I mean, it's not working. The propellers are not working.
I'm afraid I have a readiness gap.
Yes, I know. But it's extraordinary. And you look at these sort of things. In August 2022, the carrier broke down shortly afterwards. So there's a whole history of problems with these things, which is an issue.
What wasn't the original contention that we couldn't afford the aircraft to go on them, so we had the carriers but not the aircraft?
Yeah.
I mean, that certainly that is improved if you're acting in concert with NATO, because they have some aircraft. But, long story short, austerity hasn't treated any branch of the public sector very well, and the military did not escape it.
So you have the carrier, but you've got nothing to carry. I mean, it makes no sense. Like having a shopping bag, but you can't afford the shopping. It makes no sense.
Which
But
is actually the condition of a lot of people.
The centrepiece of a NATO exercise, which makes more of a case for more money to be put into defence.
Well,
you say not, that it shouldn't be priority.
I mean, look, there are some painful decisions to make, right? If you can't afford to put more money in, then you do have to row back your language and your idea of yourself as a nation on the international stage. There's no getting around it. But you can't force money to exist that isn't there, or certainly you can't do it at the expense of other things that the public would much prefer to see, such as spending on the NHS.
No, absolutely, and it is that sort of preference. And also, it's not just about our own defence, it's about we're arming other countries to protect them for the various reasons which they put out there. And it's expensive.
I don't want to yammer on, but I do feel like if we were still members of the EU, maybe some of this shortfall would be slightly masked or camouflaged, or at least not such a problem if we were acting in concert.
I'm sure you're not a sole yammerer. I'm sure there are a number of people who will support
That's a what-if argument that we're not going to go down that road for now. We're talking about military and money spent on it, and obviously the airstrikes in Yemen and also in Syria and Iraq are very much at the forefront of everybody's mind. The Americans are saying that this is just the beginning, and it's very much the start of a campaign.
And they're refusing to rule out attacks on Iranian soil as well. I mean, it's all of those sort of things. They're expecting there will be other attacks, and they're prepared for that. And this is it's the language of war, isn't it?
It is the language of war. And, Iran at the weekend was saying that Biden and Sunak's response so far was inflammatory, and that it was likely to kind of spark a wider conflict in the Middle East. But the problem is that America and the UK are still refusing to make the connection between the Houthi rebels and the situation in Gaza. So they're acting as if the Houthi rebels are only about protecting Red Sea trade, rather than Houthi rebels are acting in response to Gaza, and therefore solve Gaza, you solve the rebels. Now, as long as you refuse to make that connection, and I can see diplomatically why they do refuse, but as long as you refuse to make it, the problem does become intractable, and the escalation is sort of inevitable.
And I think this is the worry, because people say they don't want it to escalate, but at the same
yeah,
time,
exactly.
we have to be realistic and, as you say, put things into context. We have to understand where the allegiances are, a bit of the history and so on and so forth. But the language in this war, that's what I find abhorrent.
Yeah,
and this is the risk of escalation, and we have to be so careful how we phrase things as a result of it.
Although the White House have been very clear, and Lloyd Austin in his news conference saying that, you know, adamant that we are not at war with Iran. But some might say that they have been at war with Iran for a very long time with their proxies.
Absolutely, and this is the problem. Just because you say, it was Abraham Lincoln who said, if you count the tail of a dog as a leg, how many legs does a dog have? Well, it still has 4. Just because you call it's not a war, it's not an escalation, doesn't necessarily mean it. So the actions don't necessarily reflect the language, and I think that's the problem. But we have to be so careful in terms of how this is phrased, for the reasons mentioned.
Yeah.
OK, let's move to a completely different subject. Very upsetting. Brianna Ghey's mother has spoken for the first time since we've seen the sentencing of her killers.
Yeah, so it was an extraordinary interview. I saw it this morning, and anybody watching that would be, I mean, brought to tears. It was a mother who, a tragic loss, appalling circumstances, and the compassion she showed for the parents of the murderers was, you know, she said, well, they've also lost their children as a result of it. What she's called upon, I think there are some things already in place. I mean, the basic law at the moment, you can't have a WhatsApp messaging service unless you're 16. You can't be on social media until
but that's
you're
broken
30.
all the time.
But there's the difference then about enforcement and what the law is. So if she's calling for a change in what happens, she's also asked specifically for mobile phones which are only suitable for children, which don't have apps on them. Well, you can buy those phones at the moment already. The problem is that material from the dark web was being searched. Now, it's not to do with the traditional Facebook's celebrating its 20th birthday today. It's not to do with that. It's basically the deep web and the material which can be found through there, through these various other search
engines. Well, it's obviously not that deep if it's easily accessed by teenagers.
And that's the problem. And I don't want to promote where you can find these things. And part of the deep web is used for legitimate purposes. People are always concerned about privacy. They are. This is how it started. It was actually the US government who first set up the deep web, so that there could be private conversations without people spying on them. And the majority of the stuff in the deep web is actually used for legitimate purposes. But within there's all this horrendous material, which obviously inspired Scarlett in that thing. She made it very clear that she's accessed this material, and inspired is a horrible word to use, but that's what happened.
And Zoe, do you think that we can cut back on the use of social media by teenagers, or is the genie out of the bottle? It's far too late.
The thing is, I would go a long way before I'd gainsay anything Brianna Ghey's mother has said, because she's so, you know, there's so much humanity in her response. She's obviously suffering so deeply, and she's still finding so much compassion for the parents of her daughter's killers, which is just extraordinary to me. So, you know, you don't want to kind of stomp in and poo-poo it and say this isn't going to work in a practical way. But at the same time, it's you know, as you said, it's already illegal for kids to have WhatsApp. Well, it's either illegal or it's against regulations, or it's against the app's own regulations for kids under 13 to have WhatsApp, Snapchat. You know, and it's very, very difficult to police that.
Yeah. Well, and as I say, it's about enforcement. The other thing which people should mention as well is the Online Safety, what is now the Act, which I used to be calling it the Bill. Yeah. And that means that there's an obligation on these social media companies to enforce their terms and conditions. And if they don't do it, there's and the figures in millions sound small, I think it's an £18 million fine, or 10% of global turnover. Now, 10% of global turnover, when it's 300 billion in some cases, like Google, or I think it's 150 for Meta, which is Facebook and so on and so forth. They're huge, they're significant.
OK. Andrew and Zoe, thank you very much for the moment. We have to go to the break, but do stay right where you are. Coming up, a Bollywood actress attempting to raise awareness of cervical cancer fakes her own death and provokes a furious reaction. We'll discuss that next. Do stay with us. Welcome back. You are watching the press preview. Still with me, Andrew Eborn and Zoe Williams in this section. We're going to start off with the Metro, inside the Metro, and this is the story of a Bollywood actress who seems to have misread the room by faking her own death.
It is extraordinary, isn't it? I know Zoe wanted me to
No, I was
cover it.
going to make you do it. No,
No, you're going to make me do it. I can do it.
Go ahead, Andrew.
Poonam Pandey is her name. She's a Bollywood actress. She's 32 years old, and what she basically did, she faked her own death, and she says to raise awareness about cervical cancer. And what she said is basically hours after it was announced that she had died, she suddenly popped up on social media to say, "I am alive." And the reaction to that was, hang about, this is appalling that you faked your own death. She tried to justify it by saying it's important people get tested and so on and so forth. And I have to say that it's absolutely right that in the public eye, those who use their position in the public eye to raise awareness, we had King Charles very recently talk about his own condition, about prostate and so on and so forth.
Yes, but that's completely different.
No, exactly. He wasn't
Because he
faking it.
didn't fake his death. And on that sort of basis, and I think that's the sort of principle.
I think the thing is, it's not unlike that young woman from Poland who said she was Madeleine McCann, even though it's on the face of it very different to that. There are these kind of notions that come into one's head, and the rights and wrongs of them are sort of secondary to the fact that there's no mediation between it coming into your head and then you doing it. And I think this is a real shame because I'm sure she did mean well, but she just hadn't thought through like how hurtful that would be to people who have lost somebody to cervical cancer.
Well, she has apologised. She said, sorry to those I've hurt.
Yeah.
But then she defended her shock tactic because, you know, lots of people are talking about cervical cancer.
It just looks like a narcissistic move, though, doesn't it? It looks like it looks like, are you doing it to raise awareness of cancer, or are you doing it to raise awareness of oneself?
Yeah.
And that's sort of bad.
And it is true. and if it's well-intentioned, again, it's all about intention. So many people do wrong things all the time. And you're right, it's absolutely wrong to fake your death. The cause, if it's to raise awareness, is going back to that point, I think is absolutely important. But the way that she's done it is
There
wrong.
are other ways to raise awareness. Let's look at this story in The Guardian. This is a story about Labour, what they would potentially do, extending the full right to equal pay that currently exists for women to include Black, Asian and minority ethnic.
Yes, it is going to be extended as a Race Equality Act, but it's also going to be extended to disabled workers as well. And you know, you sort of look at that and think that has been a long time coming and could have been done much earlier, even arguably by the last Labour government. But parking that, it is interesting because there's a lot of spotlight on Starmer's Labour right now with the manifesto. It's been briefed furiously that they're just trying to dial it right down to make it bomb-proof. That's their way of saying it's not going to have anything contentious in it because we just don't want to be dragged down by something like the bedroom tax. Not the bedroom tax, the dementia tax, like Theresa May's manifesto. They're absolutely trying to make a document that's almost as kind of neutral and colourless as possible. And many people in Labour don't think that's the way to go. But I think they're dropping this as a kind of, even if it looks boring to you, we are still Labour and we have still got the same values. And I can see why they would go with that first.
But you also have to ask, would anybody object to that?
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
it's really a sort of vanilla policy, isn't it? And it's not, you don't have to sort of turn around on party people's base and say, well, that's a terrible idea.
I know.
It's a very good idea. Everybody would support that. And I think they're just looking for the easy wins.
Yeah.
It's surprising that it doesn't already exist.
Yeah, well...
Exactly. Coming out with ideas that everybody's surprised aren't already law. It's not exactly man the barricades, is it?
Zoe and Andrew, thank you very much.